All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Update Scope 2 Guidance. Very happy to see so many of you joining. I'll ask my colleagues who are also in the call to still let in people who arrive a bit late, but I propose we get started. For those who don't know me, I'm Kenneth, one of the co-founders of Carbon+Alt+Delete. I have a background in sustainability engineering and carbon accounting myself, but today I'm overseeing the growth of Carbon+Alt+Delete. I guess most of you know what Carbon+Alt+Delete is, but maybe for those who don't, just 2 words on that. So Carbon+Alt+Delete is a carbon accounting software to calculate the full carbon footprint of companies, set targets, simulate mitigation plans, and so on. And we work exclusively with sustainability consultants across Europe. So we work now with more than 150 sustainability consultancies across Europe, and together we manage the carbon footprint of more than 1,500 companies. I'm very happy to be joined today by Matthew Brander, who is, I would almost say, a rock star in the carbon accounting world. So Matthew, very happy to have you here. You will also do the heavy lifting today, as you will share your experience or your lights on the Scope 2 guidance review, but feel free to introduce yourself a bit more.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. Yeah, just as a brief background to me, I'm a professor of carbon accounting at the University of Edinburgh Business School. I've been working in carbon accounting for the last nearly 20 years. First of all, as a consultant, and then for the last, I guess, 12, 13 years or so as an academic, doing research and teaching related to different aspects of carbon accounting. And related to the topic of today's session, I should say I'm also a member of the technical working group for the greenhouse gas protocols revisions on the Scope 2 guidance, and also a member of the expert working group for the Science-Based Targets Initiative on Scope 2 as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Very happy to have you here, and very much looking forward to the content that you've prepared to share today with all of us. Before giving Matthew the floor, one slide on, let's say, some housekeeping rules. We're very happy to have a very big audience. The downside of that is that interaction needs to happen through the chat. So I would invite you all to put questions that you have throughout the presentation in the Q&A chat. So in Teams, there is this icon Q&A. Please put your questions in there. You can also upvote questions from other people. If we know from experience that sometimes that Q&A chat does not work for some of you due to your Microsoft restrictions, in that case, just feel free to put your questions in the regular chat, the chat where you have put your name and where you're calling from. Camera is switched off by default, and you're also muted by default. Don't take it personally, but that's what we need to do to keep it manageable. One word of introduction from my side, right? I think this is a figure that most of you know. It's taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol directly. It's an overview of all the standards and guidances that they have been publishing since they were founded, 28 years ago, so quite some time ago. Recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a new standard on land sector removals. So I'm personally very excited about that, but that's not the topic of today. The topic of today is the Scope 2 guidance, because today the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is going through a process where they are reviewing their core standards and guidances linked to corporate carbon footprinting. So the corporate standard, the Scope 3 standard, and the Scope 2 guidance. And there's also a 4th technical working group focusing on the concept of market instruments with the aim to develop a new guidance or standard around that topic. But the focus of today is on the Scope 2 guidance. I think Matthew will say way more on exactly what's being discussed and the timelines of that. maybe one more word, sorry, on the previous slide, on the exact timelines of that. So the Scope 2 guidance, the full process of reviewing the standards and the guidances was started 2 years ago with a public consultation where everyone who was willing or interested could share reflections, remarks, comments on the existing standards and guidances. The technical working groups were composed, I think, over the course of 2024. And the Scope 2 guidance is the most advanced technical working group in the sense that they have recently gone through a public consultation. So I think it was closed end of January, so 2 weeks ago. But I guess many of you have maybe actively contributed to that consultation or have seen emails passing by around that. Before I give Matthew the floor, one question to see a bit who's in the audience and what's your experience with the Scope 2 guidance review. So a quick poll, you can scan this QR code with your smartphone, or you can go to menti.com and use the code that you see on the slide. My colleague Kyle also put the link in the chat. But we're basically curious to know, have you heard about this Scope 2 guidance review? No. Are you aware of the process, but not really the content that's being discussed? Are you aware of some of the ongoing content discussions? Or maybe you have already actively contributed to the public consultation. And I see the pop-up is working. So results are coming in. I'll wait a couple of more seconds for answers coming in. So very good to see that at least some of you have actively contributed to the public consultation, but the majority of you is aware that it exists, but not so much about the details of the content. So we hope to, in an hour from now, have you all moved at least from the pink and the red part to the purple part here. And I think Matthew will help in doing so. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and Matthew, give you the floor to shed your light on the ongoing Scope 2 review.
Thanks very much. I will just share my screen. Do you see that okay?
Yeah, it's loaded. It's not yet on presenter mode.
Okay.
Yes, that's
okay.
all good.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, I'll talk for about 25 minutes, half an hour or so. And yeah, please, if there's anything that that doesn't make sense or you'd like more clarification on, please make a note of it and put it in the chat, and we can come to it in the Q&A session. So just as an agenda for what I'll talk about, I'll start off by talking a little bit about the proposed updates to the location-based method, and that's relatively uncontroversial, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on that. I'll then talk in much more detail about the market-based method for Scope 2, and so I'll run through what are seen as the current problems with the existing rules, so the current Scope 2 guidance, and this is largely a reason for why the revision is taking place, because there are recognized shortcomings with the existing rules. I'll then talk through what the current GHG protocol proposals are, so the proposals that have gone out in the recent consultation. Then I'll talk through about some of the problems with the GHG protocol proposals, and then finally I'll end up talking about some of the solutions to these ongoing problems. And then finally, the final thing I'll talk about is a separate, at the same time, but separate consultation that the GHG protocol has just been running on consequential carbon accounting related to electricity reporting. And here, one other thing that I should say right at the start of this is that I mentioned I'm a member of the technical working group for Scope 2 for the GHG protocol. I should say that everything I say is not on behalf of the the technical working group or the GHG protocol. And the views that I'm giving are very much my own independent views, particularly my more critical views of the GHG protocol's proposals. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that. So yeah, to start off with then, the location-based method. So this is hopefully familiar to everyone. This is the method by which companies use grid average emissions factors to calculate their scope 2 emissions. And current practice is generally for companies to use annual and often national level grid average emissions factors. And one of the problems with that is a certain level of inaccuracy. Many countries have, or a number of countries have fairly separate grid regions, and so using a national factor to cover multiple grid regions lacks granularity. Also, the use of using annual emissions factors can be misleading as well. If you tend to consume power at a particular time of day, you won't pick up on the temporal differences in the emissions associated with your consumption if you're using an annual factor. And so the solution that is being proposed and is in the consultation that finished 2 weeks ago is to introduce this hierarchy for grid average emissions factors. So first of all, you would prioritize spatially granular factors, so factors for, say, a local balancing area, grid area. You would then prioritize the most temporally granular factors that are available. So for example, hourly emissions factors. So this means collecting data hour by hour for electricity consumption. And then another feature of the proposed updates is to use what are called consumption-based factors. So as well as the emissions from generation on the local balancing area, you would also include the emissions associated with imported power into the grid average. So there are some sort of caveats or restrictions to when these requirements apply. One of them is that these emissions factors, these temporally and spatially explicit emissions factors, need to be accessible to reporting companies, and that means those factors need to be free to use, publicly available, and from a credible source. So if factors aren't available, then the requirements don't apply. And there will also be staged implementation. So this doesn't suddenly come in overnight. There's a period of time for companies to gear up and start collecting particularly hourly data in order to comply with these rules. So that was the location-based method. I'll now go on to talk about the market-based method, which is probably the more difficult and more controversial area of practice. So first of all, I'll talk through the perceived problems or the recognized problems with the current rules, which have led to the call for revisions. So a first problem is what can be called the accuracy problem. And this is essentially that the current system allows companies to buy certificates from generation that could not possibly have been delivered to their place of consumption. And maybe it's unfair to specifically call out Iceland, but Iceland is a particularly stark example of this. And so this issue is sometimes labeled the Iceland problem as a shorthand, but it really applies to any comparable situation. So at the moment, it's possible to buy a guarantee of origin certificate from Iceland and claim or match that against consumption that has occurred, say, in Scotland. Although there's no interconnector from Iceland to Scotland, and there's no way that someone in Scotland could have physically used or consumed power from Iceland. So often when people look at those market-based claims, they think, well, this doesn't look accurate. It doesn't look like a credible claim. And then there's also a sort of timing problem, as well as that spatial connectivity. There's also a timing issue around accuracy, where at the moment you can buy a certificate from, say, solar power that was generated during the day, and you can match that to your consumption at night, and essentially make a claim that you've consumed solar power in the middle of the night, even in the absence of any kind of storage. And again, that's generally perceived as not an accurate claim. So that's the accuracy problem. Another problem with the existing rules is the impact problem. So there is just a large amount of evidence that in most cases, the certificate markets don't help to drive additional renewables. So generally the price of certificates is just too low and too uncertain to affect investment decisions in new renewable generation. And I've put in a link there to a web page that contains lots of the existing academic research and other industry reports that reach that conclusion. And then finally, there's also what might be called the fairness problem. And this is essentially that under the current rules, it's possible that the people who have paid for the build out of renewable generation facilities aren't the ones that get to report the emissions associated with that generation. So if you have public support for renewables, in many cases, reporting companies can buy those attributes, although other people paid for the support of those renewable facilities through levies or through other forms of support. So those are three of the problems with the current rules. So now I'll talk through the current GHG protocol proposals. So these are the proposals that are in the consultation that just finished. And so the first part is for time and location matching. So this means that you would now need to buy certificates from the same time and location as the site of consumption that you're matching those certificates to. So this addresses the Iceland problem and the problem of using solar certificates at night. And there are some proposed exemptions for time matching as well, which I can talk about if people want to know more about that. A second part of the proposals, key feature, is introducing this concept of standard supply service. And this is essentially power generation that is either mandated through things like a renewable portfolio standard, or it's covered by mandatory cost recovery, or it's from generation facilities or companies that are owned by the government. And this is to address the fairness problem. So this is the idea that if general energy consumers or taxpayers have actually paid for the renewables to exist, then they should get their pro rata share of those megawatt hours. And the emissions attributes associated with that generation shouldn't be available for other reporting companies to buy in excess of their pro rata share. So that's the standard supply service component. And then there's also some proposed updates to the residual mix factor as well. So this is if you haven't bought certificates and you have to report your market-based emissions using the residual mix, you should be using a time and location matched residual mix. And in the absence of that, if that doesn't exist, then you should use a fossil mix instead. So this is essentially providing some kind of penalty and incentive if you don't collect time and location match data and match with a time and location match residual mix factor, then you have to report higher emissions with a fossil mix. Okay, so that's a quick run through of the current proposals from the GHG protocol. And now I want to walk through what I would say are some quite considerable problems with those proposals. And this isn't comprehensive, but these are some of the really key problems with the proposals that I would identify. Um, so the first one is still to do with accuracy. And even though the proposals address the Iceland problem and the solar at night problem, there is still a remaining problem that it is not credible to claim to have used one specific input generation technology from a non-traceable shared pool like a public grid. And there is very good, clear existing guidance from standard setters or guidance providers like ISEAL that provide guidance for sustainability claims for commodity markets generally. So not only specifically electricity, but they make that very clear that you can't, it's not credible to have claimed to have used, say, only certified palm oil when you're consuming palm oil from a mixed batch that contains a number of different types of palm oil. And the same would apply in the case of a public grid. It's not credible to claim that you've only used wind power when a whole number of different generation technologies were dispatching to the grid at the time and location of consumption. And the danger there is that a value chain greenhouse gas inventory, it is about quantifying and reporting the emissions from all of the sources that have been used in the value chain. And so if you say we only consume power from a wind farm and we won't report the emissions from all the other generation technologies feeding into the shared pool that we consumed from, then your value chain inventory won't be a true statement, and reporting companies will be exposed to reputational and litigation risk. And I've included this paper here that was published just a couple of months ago in Carbon Management that walks through that problem in more detail. And I think the slides will be circulated after this session. So yeah, if anyone wants to look up that paper, then please do. So yeah, another problem with the existing proposals is still the impact problem. So it's highly unlikely that creating a market for time and location matched certificates will be impactful. And there are a large number of modelling studies that show the need for what's called the third pillar. And this is some kind of incrementality or additionality or causality requirement to ensure that when people buy certificates, it is likely to drive more renewable generation. And to put that problem another way, under the current proposals, companies can choose to only match when certificates are cheap and non-additional, which would be a rational approach for reporting companies, rather than companies saying, well, we're going to match 100% of the time. They're perfectly entitled to choose to only match, say, 70 or 80 or 90% of the time, and avoid specifically the hours when there is scarcity of certificates and when the price of those certificates would be high. And that high price is the thing that drives additional investment in renewables at times and locations when supply is scarce. So that's a major problem. And another, I guess, yeah, another reason for expecting that the creation of this market won't be impactful, or a related problem, is that the current proposals don't offer any kind of differentiation in the reporting between potentially impactful actions like signing a long-term PPA and likely non-impactful actions like buying very low-cost unbundled RECs with no additionality test or requirement. So that's the ongoing impact problem. Now, with standard supply service, and I'm broadly supportive of the principle, the idea of standard supply service. I think it makes sense to have this fairness principle that if you've paid for the renewable power, then you should get to report your share of of the renewable power. But there are a number of challenges or problems with implementing or operationalizing standard supply service. And the first one is that it is going to be difficult to identify what is or isn't standard supply service. And a danger with that is that when accounting rules are difficult, they tend to be ignored. And you see that with the current rules with, say, using a residual mix. It's difficult to find residual mix factors, so very often that's just ignored. And it's also going to be difficult for companies who are buying certificates to know or to check that what they're being sold isn't actually from standard supply service. And another challenge or problem with standard supply service, as it's currently proposed, is that the allocation of the standard supply service is done on a pro rata consumption share. So it's just based on your share of total consumption, rather than the amount you paid. But we know that different types of consumer pay different levy rates. They might provide different levels of support through other mechanisms. And so a pro rata share based on consumption might not be a fair allocation. You could have large consumers who don't pay very high levies, and they get to claim their pro rata share on consumption rather than the amount of financial support that they've provided. And that rather undermines the fairness principle. And another problem to mention, and this is very much from the perspective of how useful is this information to investors? Now, arguably, investors are one of the key user groups for greenhouse gas disclosures. So we need to be thinking about whether the disclosures are actually meaningful, informative, decision relevant for investors. And one of the problems, very stark problem with the current proposals, is that companies could contract for fossil power. So a company could sign say a PPA with a coal-fired power station. They can then separately buy guarantees of origin certificates from a wind farm, and then report zero emissions for their Scope 2 market-based. And there's a problem there because it doesn't provide any information for investors who are interested in trying to assess the investee company's exposure to climate-related risk, and particularly climate regulatory risk. So a coal-fired power station could face increasing carbon pricing, it could face increasing regulation and be closed down or become non-competitive, and that's a major source of risk for the off-taker company, so the company that's on the off-taker side of the power purchase agreement. But the current proposals and information doesn't provide any information to investors on that situation. All they would see is that this company looks wonderful because it's reporting zero emissions in its market-based Scope 2. So that's a problem. And ironically, the market-based method might provide information on exposure to climate-related reputational or litigation risk, precisely because of the accuracy problem. So if companies are making false claims that they use 100% renewables, or that their value chain emissions from electricity purchased and consumed are zero, that actually indicates that they have some exposure to reputational or litigation risk if they're called out for making false claims. So the market-based method might be an indicator of risk created by the market-based method. And then finally, from an impact investor perspective, this is where the impact problem re-emerges. So if you're an impact investor, you're wanting to invest in companies or support companies that are driving real change in the real economy, but the proposals for time and location matching are unlikely to achieve impact, and so market-based information is unlikely to be relevant for impact investors. So I'll quickly talk through some possible solutions to these remaining problems. The first is to introduce some kind of causality, additionality requirement, which would help to address both the accuracy and impact problems. Or if that's not acceptable, and there has been a lot of pushback on the idea of an additionality requirement, the alternative is just to clearly state that market-based accounting is not part of a value chain greenhouse gas inventory, and to be very, very clear so that companies don't make false claims, very clear that companies can't buy certificates and claim we use 100% renewables, because those are the types of claims that are contrary to ICL, contrary to claims guidance, and companies are exposed to reputational risk. But you can make other types of claims, like we match 100% of our consumption with attributes from renewables. To partially address the impact problem, you could introduce tiered reporting for market-based accounting. So actions that are likely to be impactful, so signing a long-term PPA or buying a REC that's passed an additionality test could be in one reporting bracket, and then market-based actions that are less likely to achieve impact, like buying low-cost unbundled RECs that haven't passed an additionality test, they could be reported separately. And that would help to provide information and incentive for companies to undertake impactful actions. A possible solution, or part of a solution to the problems with standard supply service, is for companies to only use certificates for voluntary procurement above their standard supply allocation if those certificates have been certified by an independent third party that they are not from standard supply service. Then another piece of information which would help to address some of these problems is to, in addition to location-based and market-based reporting, have companies report the proportion of their consumption covered by contracts for different types of generation. So this would cover the cases where a company can contract for coal-fired power generation, but they don't have to report that anywhere under the current proposals. So that would be very useful information. Something else that would be very useful information, again separately from location-based and market-based reporting, is for companies to report their consumption multiplied by a grid marginal factor. And this is useful for information on the sort of marginal impact of a company's consumption on grid emissions. And I can go into more detail on this if of interest. But this is particularly of interest in the case of, say, data centers that are locating in an area. A generator is building, say, a coal-fired power generator right next door to the data center. The data center isn't directly contracting for that power, say, through a PPA or a direct wire, but nevertheless, it is likely that that large increase in load was the thing that justified the building out of that coal-fired power generator. And this kind of marginal reporting would help to identify those cases. And then finally, the GHG protocol really needs to clearly state that the market-based method is about the purchase of attributes and not the purchase of actual electricity. And it's the proposals and the current existing Scope 2 guidance are almost deliberately unclear on this point, that these are two separate things. Companies can separately contract for actual power and pay for actual power from a particular source, and then completely separately they can buy attributes from a wind farm or a solar farm. And at the moment, the language within the proposals and the existing guidance conflate those two things, and I think to a large extent deliberately conflate those two things, and that's misleading. And then the final thing that I will talk about very briefly, just for information, is that alongside the location-based and market-based proposals, the GHG protocol also had a separate consultation on consequential accounting. And the idea here is that there should or could be separate consequential reporting alongside the standard greenhouse gas inventory. And the purpose of consequential accounting is to report on changes in emissions caused by some kind of intervention. So if a company introduces load shifting and they want to report on the reduction in emissions they've caused from that intervention, then they can use consequential accounting to do that. Similarly, if a company signs a long-term PPA, for example, and causes the build out of a new renewable project, it might not be directly within their value chain, so they might not report it within their market-based scope 2, but they can separately report the change in emissions they think they have caused by their action. And so that consultation has closed as well, and it's likely or it's expected that this work on consequential accounting is going to be taken up by the Actions and Market Instruments Working Group. And just to say briefly, consequential accounting is really useful for reporting on changes caused by the reporting company that occur outside of the inventory boundary. If you only have the inventory, then you don't have any information on things that you affect, whether positively or negatively, that occur outside of that inventory boundary. And similarly, it's very useful if companies are introducing abatement actions to reduce their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's very important to check that those actions don't inadvertently, unintentionally cause adverse consequences outside of the inventory boundary. So yeah, very happy to talk about that too. So yeah, I've included some references to other information, and I will stop sharing my screen at this point and hand back to Kenneth.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, for the great insights. We had foreseen some Q&A towards the end, but I think it makes sense that I quickly share some questions that came in through the chat. I think there are 3 big groups of questions, some related to emission factors, some related to the exception threshold, and some related to the broader concept of market-based reporting. Maybe to start with the exception threshold, I see some questions, rightfully so, but maybe getting a bit nervous on how that exactly will work for very small companies. Can you say something on the exception threshold for hourly matching under market-based?
The consultation contains questions about potential exemptions, and so at this stage, the GHG protocol is just trying to collect views and information on what kind of exemption thresholds would work. And one proposal is to have a load-based exemption threshold, so companies with a total load within a grid region below a certain level, and they're consulting on what that level should be, would be exempt from the requirements. Another possibility is to have a small and medium-sized enterprise exemption. So if a company is classed as an SME, then it would be exempt, or some kind of combination of those two. So yeah, and at this stage, the GHG protocol is just is keen to collect views on what those exemptions should be.
But it's unclear which direction it's going. That's really still open for discussion and decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the purpose of the consultation, is to gather views. I mean, I think one of, obviously there are concerns that if the exemptions are too weak, or they're too broad, then you really don't move many people into the new reporting requirements, and particularly for things around the market-based method and the impact problem, is that creating a certificate market will only have impact if enough companies engage in that certificate market. So if too many companies are excluded or have exemptions, then demand within that market will be very small, and it is even more unlikely that it will be impactful. So things like the kind of legacy clauses for existing contracts, that's where, you know, there's some consideration. If the legacy clauses and exemptions are too expansive,
Yeah,
then this market will just, you know, never materialize.
that's very clear. I'm personally very curious to see where they will land on this specific topic. Second group of questions has to do with emission factors, emission factor databases, emission factor availability. I think we all know that emission factors for electricity today are okay to good, but definitely not perfect. Some are missing the well to tank piece, or are not always clear, or are consumption based, production based, not consumption based, and so on. With the additional requirements that will be imposed, emission factor database will need to step up as well. Are they somehow involved in this discussion? How do you see them evolve? Will IEA, AIB, UK Gulf emission factors? People have questions around that. I know it's still very early days, but anything you can share on emission factor database availability?
Yeah, I mean, so providers of emissions factors, there are a number of database data providers who are on the technical working group. So their perspective is voiced via the technical working group. I'm sure other providers are also feeding in either through conversations with the GHG Protocol Secretariat, I would expect, and also through the consultation process. And yeah, I mean, you know, one thing to mention, I mentioned it in the presentation, is that there will be an exemption. So if it's the case that no accessible free to use emissions factors are available, that means that the requirement does not apply. And another consideration when developing these rules is there's something of a chicken and egg situation. So it's possible to say, well, we can't introduce these accounting requirements because there aren't any emissions factors. And emissions factor databases say, well, we're not going to provide those emissions factors because the accounting rules don't require them and no one wants them. So there is a view that, okay, well, if you create the rules and signal that we're going to start requiring time and location specific grid average emissions factors, and you have a nice long lead-in time as well, that gives everyone lots of time to start thinking about how they collect data on an hourly basis, and also for database providers to step up in terms of what they provide.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, right? I think the role of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol rather to set the way how things should be done, rather than think about within today's limitations what's possible. Maybe a final question, and to be honest, it's also some that I have, so I sneak my own question in here. But I think that the issues you list with market-based are almost inherent to the nature of market-based, or I think hard to really address. Has it been on the table to get fully rid of market-based reporting, or fully move it to the consequential reporting, kind of out of scope? Has that been discussed? What was kind of the dynamics around that idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a difficult one because I think that it's possible if the proposals had been stronger around things like an additionality requirement, there would be a stronger case for saying, well, this does belong within a value chain inventory. I have to say, and yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem with the process, that there wasn't a lot of reflection, or the process didn't start with saying, look, we want to write market-based accounting rules so that they are consistent with the value chain inventory. What do we have to do to make that the case? The process rather worked the other way around, saying, well, what do we want market-based accounting to look like? Time and location matching. And we've landed in a place where that solution, that proposal, is not consistent with a value chain inventory, and it's not consistent with making credible claims around the use of renewables. And so that, yeah, the process maybe was the wrong way around. There should have been a very clear objective, and we've landed in a place where we've got accounting rules. Now we're asking, well, what are these actually useful for, and what kind of claims can companies credibly make? And if that's where we've landed, I think the sort of from here to the end point for the revisions is to provide very clear guidance on what companies can claim if they're doing time and location matching with market-based accounting. Otherwise, companies will go out and they will make claims and then they'll be called out for it, which is the experience under the current rules as well.
Okay, that's a very interesting insight. Thank you for sharing that, Matthew. I think in the interest of time, I know we've not been able to address all questions in the chat, but I'm going to take over the screen to end with some reflections on the Carbon+Alt+Delete side, how we look at it. On our side, we are not part of a technical working group. We have been actively contributing to the public consultation, but I think we look at it more from an application point of view as a software provider, but also knowing that we work with consulting companies serving typically mid-sized companies with their carbon footprinting, mid-sized companies going really from an SME with, let's say, 100 FTE up to a company with several thousands, thousands FTE, a couple of billion turnover. Three thoughts we want to share on our side is one, I think we very much welcome the additional guidance that is in the Scope 2 proposal on emission factor selection, right? I think I personally very much like the idea of having a clear hierarchy that you can use to assess what is now the best emission factor to be used. Spatial matching or spatial component is more important than the temporal one. Then ideally consumption, if not available production. I think that kind of streamlines the way of thinking about how to find good emission factors. And the same about availability, right? I think it's very good that it's defined what emission factors are when they're available and can be used. I personally hope that also triggers some emission factor database providers to step up and make their emission factors better available. I'm thinking about IEA to name one, right? And that's the chicken egg problem that Matthew refers to. So this, I think, is something we really benefit from as a carbon accounting community. The stricter guidance on market-based reporting. I think Matthew raised a lot of valid points where it's not strict enough. And I think I agree with all of them. But it definitely feels like a step in the right direction. Personally, I think that's one of the favorite of my colleague Felix, the idea that residual mix, if not available, you should use the fossil-based mix. I think it's a very concrete but very good one. We see a lot that companies that report market-based, they don't have explicitly a green electricity contract. In a lot of cases, they just then use the country average emission factor, which is heavily underestimating the emissions of their market-based non-green consumption. So having there a default option that quote unquote punishes them more for a fossil-based market-based consumption. It's a very small thing, but it's very tangible, and it will make the market-based emission number more prominent. I think where we have some concerns or open question is, okay, how exactly will this work in practice, right? And I've seen questions around, will this not be too difficult for smaller companies? And I think I have the same concern. It's maybe more concern, not that fear. I think a lot will depend on the exact exemption threshold that will be imposed. Just to be clear, like you have very big companies that trade directly on wholesale markets, and those companies perfectly know what they buy when, quarter hour by quarter hour. So I think for those type of companies, there is a lot of room to impose way more stricter reporting rules without imposing a lot of additional admin burden on them. At the same time, I know a lot of you probably have been discussing with people on even the difference between market and location based and try to explain that concept. So then I can imagine that having to also explain why you need hourly matching, etc., makes things more difficult, in particular to get companies started. Electricity markets are sometimes region specific. So now I'm talking from a European context, but I think we would benefit from some good appendices with very concrete examples, how to define spatial matching, how you define regions, is it countries, is it synchronous areas, etc., etc. And the final one, it's more of a personal reflection, but the Scope 2 guidance, you have one section on market-based, you have one section on location-based, but we might end up in a world where different emission factors are being used from different sources for the market-based and location-based component. They're each in itself better, but they might be based on different assumptions on emission, on power plant efficiency, etc. Right? So that might make it a bit harder to compare the market-based and location-based emissions with each other or over time. So, I mean, these are practical reflections. We've shared them as feedback on the public consultation. So we're very much looking forward to see where the final version will land. Matthew, I think the initial timing was to have the final Scope 2 guidance ready over the course of 2027. Is that still the timeline?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that's right. Yeah, that's the last sort of timetable I've seen. Yeah.
And will it be January or December 2027, or that's not something you can comment
I
on?
really don't know. I think there is a plan for a further public consultation on the sort of phase 2 aspects of the revisions that the technical working group will be working on. So, you know, other disclosures and so on. So that will happen in 2026, and yeah, the plan is for the final guidance to come out in 2027. But I really don't know, and there will be considerations because the GHG protocol has these other technical working groups for actions and market instruments and scope 3s and so on. Whether there's a plan to wait for all of them to be ready and then release them at once, and then, you know, that just depends on how quickly all of those groups complete their work.
All right, very good. So still a lot of time to discuss, and then let's think things over. With that, I know we have addressed or I tried to group the main questions in the chat before and ask those questions to Matthew. I'm aware that we have not been able to address each question individually. I've seen in the chat that some of you have started answering each other questions. Thanks a lot for that. As always, we will go through the questions again and we will follow up one-on-one where needed. But in the interest of time, I would like to wrap it up here with maybe 2 more words on other events that we organize on carbon accounting topics. So I think most of you here in the call are aware that we organize this, what we call expert series webinars every 2 months. So today we have zoomed in on the Scope 2 guidance. In April, we'll zoom in on the Science-Based Target Net Zero Standard, the new the version 2 there. And over the course of 2026, we will zoom in on the other greenhouse gas protocol technical working groups, the corporate standard, the Scope 3 standard, the actions and market instruments. And we always try to have an external speaker who's part of that technical working group and give that person the floor to share his or her insights. Besides, we also organize 2 other events. March 12th, so in a month from now, exactly a month from now, 4 weeks from now, we have a big event in Brussels where we basically do what we do here, but then physically we will have 8 keynote speakers from EFRAG, from Science-Based Target Initiative, from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol technical working groups. We will give keynotes on topics like the Scope 3 guidance, ESRS, CSRD, and so on. It's an invitation-only event. It's specifically for sustainability consultants. If you still want to join and you have not yet received an invitation, feel free to reach out to us. And in 3 weeks from now, we also have a webinar focused on the market dynamics in the Nordics and how carbon accounting in the Nordics is doing today. So we'll share the slides, we'll share all this material with you after the call. And with that, I thank you for your time today, for your participation and interaction through the chat. I hope you've learned something, I'm pretty sure of that. And then I wish you a great rest of the day. Thanks a lot and see you next time.